On Unit 2, we'll be talking about property purchasing guidelines and the major do's and don'ts of purchasing property. So now we've covered, different property types, different sorts of cladding, and giving you guys a really good overview of understanding different titles. So everything should make sense, and it's, everything works in unison. And what we'll be covering moving forward for the next few slides is the do's and don'ts, the property purchasing guidelines. And you can see I've segmented this into two different columns on what makes a good purchase and what makes a bad purchase. And just to go over them one by one, we've got on the buy column here, we've got road frontage properties, we've got freehold properties, we've got brick and tile, we've got weatherboard, we've got properties that are subdividable, meaning that the land can actually be segmented and sold, and we've also got properties that are close to good amenities in the community as well. Those are all the checklists that you should be going after when it comes to buying a property, especially for trading and making it easy to sell on the other end. And we also have a big list of what not to buy. And this list is a lot more lengthy than the buy list, because often there are more properties that you should be aware of that you shouldn't ever touch. So, what classifies under this don't buy list, under the purchasing guidelines. So we've got pylons, which is power towers, basically, cell phone towers, properties down a driveway, railways, motorways, plaster or leaky homes, cross leases, leaseholds, bad neighborhoods with gangs, housing New Zealand or state housing areas. We've got steep land or uneven land, main roads and busy roads, and properties that are beyond repairable properties as well. Now you'll notice that I've put down cross lease in there. That's not to say that cross leases are something that you want to stay away from completely. The reason why it's actually in the don't buy column is because I've had experience in the past where cross lease are not as favorable as freehold properties. They're still great properties, don't get me wrong, but if it came to a buyer's perspective, they would favor a freehold more so than a cross lease. And that doesn't mean you're not going to sell your cross lease. It just may mean you're looking for that certain buyer to actually buy your cross lease property. So definitely you're still able to buy and sell properties in a cross lease title. It's definitely not as bad as a leasehold. Leasehold is something that I wouldn't touch at all, but it's still not as favorable as the brick and tiles, the weatherboards, the freehold properties that we've talked about on the left hand column as well. There are other couple things that you guys might be thinking, well, what's wrong with buying close to a motorway or a railway? And that really depends on how close you are to it. If you're close to the point where it's just a good amenity and you get easy access to go on the motorway and it's faster to get into the city, well, that's not an issue. However, if you're living right next to the motorway and there's noise issues, especially with railways or motorways, and there's a lot of noise, then obviously that's going to affect the sellability of the property, and you're going to have a lot more difficulty finding that one buyer that will actually buy it with all these noise issues as well. So guys, I just want to cover a little bit more detail about why something is in a good to buy column and why something is in a don't buy column. And the first one for the buy column is road frontage. And what does road frontage mean? It's essentially meaning that it's facing the road, and the benefits here is that it's very easy to access the home. You're not down a driveway or anything like that. It's easy to take the trash out, etc. And generally it will have a decent amount of sunlight because you're not down a driveway or a cross lease section where other properties are actually hindering and blocking that sunlight as well. Also, I find with road frontage properties, there's a sense of more security, because often we find that a lot of burglaries or break-ins often happen in properties where it's not visible to the street, where people aren't walking past it or cars aren't driving past it. They often happen down driveways or properties right next to the parks and stuff like that, where people can't see if they're doing anything dodgy and they quickly make a easy escape. Whereas for a road frontage property, there's a sense of security, because if you're going to do anything dodgy, your neighbors will probably be able to see that just from their home. They can actually see what's happening, and also people walking past and cars driving by will help deter that factor as well. So that's one of the reasons why road frontage homes are always very kind of sought after as well. So we've already talked about freehold properties on a freehold title, guys, and the benefits here are pretty clear. So, the advantageous things about freehold properties is that it provides the greatest benefit to the owner in respect of enjoyment and use. You own the entire land and you're able to actually make any additions or alterations to your property, of course, subject to the council bylaws and any consent and government regulation. But other than that, you don't actually have to worry about getting your neighbors to allow you to do these certain things, unlike cross-lease properties. Another good addition on the buy list is of course properties with brick and tile cladding. They're low maintenance, they're proven performance with longevity. It looks good. It's visually, aesthetically pleasing. Sorry. There's a good public perception about it, and properties generally with brick and tile can demand a higher price as well. So you can understand why it's a no-brainer on why this is on the buy list when you're looking at buying properties. And of course, we can't have the brick and tile on our list without adding weatherboard to our list as well. And again, it's a great classic look. It's a very popular choice in New Zealand. It's very versatile and resilient and capable of withstanding a lot of the weather changes and the climate change. And the building is actually flexible. It allows for movement. So during the different seasons with you've got summer and winter and stuff like that, with the heat and the cold, materials can shrink and expand, and timber actually allows that movement, so you'll be exposed to less damage caused by earthquakes and stuff like that as well. Good rule of thumb is buy brick and tile and buy weatherboard homes. So on this slide here, we haven't actually gone over what subdividable properties are or what subdivision even is. And essentially, subdividable properties are properties that have a lot of land, and it's case by case on what area you're in. But essentially, if a property has a lot of land, there's a chance it may actually be subdividable, meaning you can actually divide the land up. And this is actually attractive to developers or other investors that actually subdivide. This isn't really my bag, it's not my territory, but essentially the more land it has, the more the property is actually going to be worth because of that land potential. That land potential where you can actually add another property or another dwelling or house on the section. So, I find this is probably in the advanced level of property and making money in property, where you can actually subdivide land up and build on it and then sell it and so forth. It's a little bit too tricky for me at this stage. I haven't looked into it because I like the whole buying and selling. It's a very straightforward business model and it's helped me make a lot of money, and that's something I'm good at, so it's something that I'll stick to for the time being. Not to say I won't look at subdividable properties, but certainly the main thing I do is I fix up the house and put it back on the market. Should a developer or an investor want to come buy it off me and actually subdivide and do the development themselves, well, that's up to them, and by all means they're allowed to benefit from that. And a subdividable property, it's a no-brainer. The more land it has, the more it's worth. And you have to go through the steps of obtaining a resource consent and building consents and so forth to actually erect another dwelling on the site. So to me, it's too costly, there's too much time involved, and it takes too long to actually realize the profits. So something that I'd stay away from, and I encourage you guys to kind of stay away from this for the time being as well. So we're on to the last point on the buy list, and that's having a good neighborhood and a community. So your property value, of course, is going to be worth a lot more if the neighborhood's good and the community is also very good as well. And things to look out for when you are buying property is, are there amenities close by? Is there shopping centers or grocery stores where they can go and do their shopping? Is there doctors close by? What about schools? How far away is the public transport? Is it close by, or is it, a 30-minute drive away? That's going to obviously deter buyers if it's too far away and there's no amenities close by. You want to make things convenient for the owners and the tenants and anyone that's looking to actually buy the property back off you. And if you actually have these amenities very close by, you can actually demand a slightly higher price or slightly higher rent. If you're living right next to the grocery store and you don't actually have to commute to do your shopping, then that not only are you saving time, you're also saving money on the petrol mileage as well, and that in return will reflect back on the sales price when it comes to selling the property. And that's pretty much the major points you should be looking for when it comes to buying. But keep in mind, it's not just one thing you should be looking for. It's not just the neighborhood or the community that makes everything a-okay. You want to make sure that you tick as much of the checkpoints as you can, and that ensures you're buying really, really well. So you want to ensure that it's got a good neighborhood and a good community, as well as is it road frontage? Is it a freehold property title? Does it have all these other factors? Is it brick and tile? What's the cladding? Is it weatherboard? So all good if you've got a good area, but if your cladding's terrible, then well, it still doesn't make for a good purchase. So it's keeping that checklist as a kind of starting point on how you should look for properties, and the more it has on the pro side, the better the property becomes. Right, so you don't want to be just buying a good clad but a terrible neighborhood. That's not going to work either. So it's having a combination of those good points that makes for a successful property purchase, and again a successful sale that you can actually realize the profits on the other end as well. So we've covered all the good points on what you should be looking out for when you're making a property purchase, and now we're going to be covering a little bit more in detail on all the don'ts, on why you shouldn't be buying properties like with a cross lease title. And as I mentioned a bit earlier on, there's nothing too wrong with a cross lease, but let's just take the example of explaining it to a first home buyer. So if a first home buyer and they're going to an agent, they're looking at a property, and they check out a freehold property. So the agent goes, well, you can do anything you want. You can do renovations, and you don't have to inform anyone. If you want to, build a garage or have a pool or something, as long as you follow the council requirements, you're good to go. You don't need consent from your neighbors, and don't worry about the noise. As long as you're building it or doing this construction or renovation process during these hours, you're in the clear, right? Now, when that same buyer goes to a property with a different agent, and the agent's saying, well, this is a cross lease property. What does a cross lease property mean? Well, it means you're leasing their land and they're leasing your land, and if you were to do any renovation, you actually have to get their consent before you can do so. Well, instantly, the buyer in their mind is thinking, well, this doesn't seem as desirable, or it doesn't give me enough advantage as a freehold property would. So I'm not really convinced I should be buying cross lease because it's a cross lease. I don't really own the land, right? Now, even though a cross lease is you leasing your neighboring property's land and vice versa, and essentially, I haven't witnessed too many issues with neighbors not letting you do certain things, and most vendors aren't even aware what type of estate type their title is anyway. So there shouldn't be real dramas. However, if you can make the sale smoother and easier for the end purchaser, and take away those questions by providing a freehold property, well, that just becomes more favorable than a cross lease property. Doesn't mean cross leases won't sell. It just means a freehold property is a little bit more favorable because of what I just explained. So, the cross lease is, you do have those limitations, and that's why I've put that on the don't buy list. I personally, we still buy cross lease properties every now and again, but the majority of our properties we work with are probably in the freehold section. That's always more favorable, and it makes for a quick sale in any market as well. So, now you guys know why cross lease is not as favored as a freehold and some of the other estate types. So another thing to look out for on the don't buy column is properties down a driveway. And this is kind of similar to a cross lease property because, again, it's not to say that you won't be able to sell it. People definitely do buy these properties down a driveway, which is how we're able to buy these properties first and then put it on the market. But in terms of favorability, it's not going to be as sought after as something that's road frontage without a driveway altogether. You can already assume the nuisance and the inconvenience down a driveway will cause, and basically, your annoying neighbors, vice versa, when you're trying to enter or leave the property. It's inconvenient when you're even getting the mail or taking the rubbish out, because people have to move aside just to, have that compromise of you driving your car in. And it can also actually be a lot difficult for larger vehicles to drive through, when we're trying to do renovations, or you're getting moving trucks in and out, or when tenants leave. It's just a big hassle because the trucks, have to be very careful to not hit the fences or anything like that, or damage a house that's very close in the whole scenario. and parking in the driveway, leaving rubbish in the driveway, who's responsible for what. These are the type of conversations that you're going to have to be dealing with when you actually live down a driveway or have to deal with properties down a driveway. It's also dangerous if you have young ones playing in the driveway as well. There's been stories that I've heard a long time ago where, neighbors have actually run over the kids off a neighboring property because they were playing on the driveway and they couldn't see it in the rear view mirror. So there's all sorts of these horror stories. Again, buying a driveway property is not an end all be all, but of course, the more favorability is in properties that are road frontage. So that's what I would kind of look out for. Also, depending on where the market is, would mean your property down a driveway may actually take a lot longer in a cooling market to sell versus a property that's road frontage. Depending if the market was actually a lot hotter and there's a lot more demand for property in general, hey, your property down a driveway might still sell very quickly, but I would rather not deal with that risk of it sitting on the market longer than expected. And, it's much easier to deal with something that can just get sold instantly as well. Properties with big contours and steep land should also be avoided as well. It's a no-brainer. Access to the property will be difficult, especially if it's very steep. You're driving in and out as well. Any future landscaping work is difficult and generally more expensive when there's more contours involved. Maintaining the land, such as mowing and just general garden work, can be more difficult as well. The property is prone to slippage if the foundations are not strong, and if there's any earthquakes and so forth, you're prone to more damage as well. If it has a view, it may offset some of the contour, but it has to be a pretty spectacular view to offset some of the negatives, negative things that come with buying a property with a big contour or steep land as well. I've heard horror stories again where properties are on a contour next to a cliff and the land is already very steep. However, there's a beautiful mansion that's built on top of it, beautiful views and whatnot, but small natural disasters where there's more water kind of hitting the rocks, or there's a lot of wind, or there's a storm or earthquake or whatever. I've seen in the news where houses have actually fully collapsed into the ocean, or had a massive slippage and the structure is fully damaged because the house is built on a contour or steep land. So again, it just limits your buyer base. And you have to look out for that certain buyer that's after this type of property, and that's very difficult. So it's always a lot easier to buy something where a lot of buyers take an interest in it rather than looking for that one buyer that will get this across the line. Another one to look out for is properties on a main road and busy road. Now, depending on the area, it doesn't mean that just because it's on a main road and busy road, there's no interest in the property. Sometimes when you're on a main road or busy road, it's because there's a lot of amenities close by and cars are driving through. I personally prefer properties that are kind of tucked away off the main road, but still close by to all the amenities, and they tend to get awesome values anyway. But that's just something to look out for. Again, it's not an end all be all, but if you're on a main road and on a busy road, but also the other boxes are ticked for all the things to avoid, then that's something definitely you want to avoid. However, if you're on a main road and a busy road, but you've got the road frontage property, you've got the brick and tile build, you're in a great area and neighborhood, that may offset that negative connotation of the busy road. It's no wonder why people prefer kind of living away from a main road or busy road, because it can be hard to drive in and out to your own property. It's obviously very annoying and inconvenient, and especially with a lot of cars driving past, it can be quite noisy as well. So another one on the list to avoid is properties within a close vicinity to Housing New Zealand owned properties or state housing areas. And the reason being is because areas linked around or within close vicinity to these properties are often linked into rougher neighborhoods and rougher areas. Houses owned by Housing New Zealand are often actually occupied by people on the benefit or unemployed or have some form of disability. Depending on the neighbor or neighborhood, they can actually make the sales process quite difficult. And people generally want to live in a neighborhood where everyone's friendly, everyone's actually working, and everyone's contributing, rather than being in an area where it may not be as enticing. Houses and properties are generally not maintained, and they're in a bad condition because the tenants living in it it's not their own house, so why should they pay to get it fixed up? So often, this bad visual representation of the property can affect surrounding properties as well. And, there is a plus side though. So if the area will actually be under development or is going to be gentrified, meaning that more wealthier people are going to move in, then that may thrive the whole area and the whole community as well. So that's something to look out for if the area is going to be under development or it is slowly going to be gentrified, because it can make the area better. So motorways are the next one that we're going to be covering on what to avoid, and it's a no-brainer. If they're noisy, if you're close to the motorway, there'll be a lot of traffic and it'll be noisy, so that's no good. No good for the person buying the home as a homeowner, investor, or tenants alike. A lot of traffic means it can be very difficult to leave and get home during peak hours. However, again, as I mentioned earlier, it can be a good thing. It can be a good thing in terms of convenience, depending on how far away you actually live. And you can see an example here that some of the highlighted properties that I've shown here, they're a little bit further away from the highway. There's one that I've circled that is closer to the highway, which is what I'll avoid, but the two other highlighted areas closer to the bottom of the image, those are the properties that aren't going to have too big of an issue because they're not close enough to actually hear all the noise and all the issues related with the motorway. Again, the same can be said for railway lines as well, and depending how far your property is or how close it is will determine whether it's a nuisance or a convenience factor for you. And of course, if you actually take the public transport or train lines to get to work, then it might be more convenient than hassle. But equally, if you don't actually use the transport but live too close, no one's going to want to buy right next to a railway line because of all the noise. And not only that, the difference between the railway and the motorway is you also have to deal with a lot of foot traffic. You also have to deal with a lot of people getting off the train and making noise and whatnot. Think kids finishing high school and whatnot, and often they can be quite noisy and disruptive. So that's something to look out for as well. As we've discussed before, just stay away from plaster and leaky homes. As mentioned, it's got a terrible public perception. And the instant connotation that plaster and monolithic homes associated with is that it's a leaky home. Whether or not it's actually leaking is irrelevant, because as long as the public perception is it is a leaky home, no one's going to want to buy it. So there's no point buying something, even if you get it for a bargain, if you can't sell it on the other end, because you'll never realize your profits and actually be stuck with a property that is not, it's not worth anything to you. You've got capital tied in, but you can't get it out. It's the worst thing you can do. So as a rule of thumb, just stay away from plaster homes and monolithic homes and don't buy them at all. So guys, another big one to avoid is properties within close vicinity to pylon towers, also known as power towers. And the big public perception is that pylon towers actually cause cancer. Now, whether they actually do or not, again, is irrelevant. As long as people think they do, it's enough for me to stay away from the property, because it means if I buy something and I can't sell it, it's a waste of time, waste of effort, and tied up capital that I can't actually get back on the other end. There's also issues that the pylon towers might actually fall on your house during a storm or something like that. And although it's unlikely, it's still better living next to no obstructing obstacle like this rather than being next to the pylon tower. As a rule of thumb, pylon towers just shouldn't be visible when you stand outside your property or inside your property from any window or any angle when you're staying outside the property. If you can see it, it's probably too close. Now, if you have expansive views and you can see pylon towers away from a distance, the rule of thumb for me is as long as they're away from the actual pylon towers by 100 meters, I'm in the clear. But it's still case on case, and it's always best to keep in mind that properties within a close range to pylon towers often don't do as well or stay on the market a lot longer than properties without. So just stay away from properties with a pylon tower. And I've even been to open homes where pylon towers are very close by, and it actually feels strange as well. You can actually feel almost electric current, and you can almost hear it buzzing, and it just feels strange being very close by. So it's something you definitely want to avoid and not buy at all. Guys, the same goes for cell phone towers, and you just want to be careful because cell phone towers come a lot more sleek, and often they can actually be covered up so it doesn't actually look like a form of tower or a cell phone tower. And it's the same bad perception that, you know, cell phone towers cause radiation or they cause cancer and they damage health. And whether or not that's actually true or not, I don't know. But if the public perception disagrees with something, then that's what you have to follow, because you want to make sure that the properties you're buying are sellable on the other end. And, you know, you just want to be careful, because on this image here, you can see I've highlighted a cell phone tower, and you can see it just looks like a lamppost, and you can't really tell. But certainly if other buyers are going to be able to pick it up, that's something you want to stay away from. I know, you know, in certain countries like Singapore, they actually make all these cell phone towers into beautiful kind of art pieces, and that's all good and well, but, you know, it's still a cell phone tower at the end of the day, and that's something you don't want to be too close by because of the public perception that it can cause health issues, whether true or not. And again, we've discussed how terrible leasehold properties are. So, you know, just to go over it again, you don't own that land, you only own the house, and therefore you still have to pay rent to the landlord. And if your lease term is up, the landlord doesn't renew your lease, well, guess what? You'd be forced to actually leave with your house on his land, and that's just not something you want to deal with. The landlord may also impose restrictions on the land. You know, for example, you can't have any sleep outs or extensions to your existing building. Very similar to the case of you know, being a tenant. There's a lot of things you can't do, or buying a property in an apartment. There's a lot of things you can't do. But especially with a leasehold, you don't want to be dealing with the situation that your rents are going to go up, or your land lease is going to go up, because there's no way of predicting where that price point will sit. And essentially it's up to the lessor that owns the land to charge whatever he feels like. So you definitely don't want to be giving the power in his hands to actually dictate what you can and can't do. So stay away from any properties that are leasehold. This will save you an absolute fortune, and if you were to go out and buy it, you'd never ever be able to sell it again. Another big one to stay away from, guys, is P houses or meth houses, or properties that have contamination of meth or has been used as a manufacturing plant. And the public perception is that, you know, no one actually wants to live in a house or house anyone else in that property that has had illegal substances, you know, surrounding the property or has contaminated the property. And properties that, you know, have meth in them are basically unsafe to live in, depending on the level. But decontamination can be very costly depending on the levels identified in the house. You know, as well as the bad public perception. Even if the levels are safe within threshold, people are still put off, and it makes it extremely hard to sell. You know, I've had first-hand experience dealing with a property with meth in it, and it was well below the dangerous levels. So it was well within the healthy levels, or I wouldn't say healthy, but within the levels that's actually considered safe or not damaging. And guess what? You know, when we disclosed this to the public, it was extremely hard to find a buyer that was willing and prepared to take it on. And eventually we actually found an investor that was prepared to take it on, because, you know, I think he may have used the property for rental purposes, or if he was to sell it again. I'm not sure what he was going to do with the property, but we still managed to turn a profit. However, if it wasn't for that buyer, I think we'd still be having a hard time figuring out how are you going to actually sell this. Or is it the case that we have to rip out all the gyp boards and all the internal building and resurface everything just so that we could sell it, just so that there wouldn't be any traces. So it's something, if you can avoid, you definitely want to avoid this, as it's not only costly, you know, it can be a very time-consuming exercise, as well as just, you know, the public perception. People just don't want a property that's associated with meth or P, regardless of the levels, full stop. One very important thing to avoid when you're looking at purchasing property is ensuring that your property that you're looking at buying is in a good neighborhood. You definitely don't want to be buying a property even if it ticks all the other boxes, but it's in a bad neighborhood and there's gangs on the street, for example. Now, the gangs probably won't look as friendly as the image that I've got here, but equally, if you've got a lot of people loitering around outside, you can imagine that it's going to have a negative effect on anyone owning the property, or any future tenants as well. And you can bet your dollar that you know, you're going to have a very difficult time trying to sell a property, especially if your open homes are going to be interrupted by people drinking or playing loud music, or there's wafts of smoke in the area and stuff like that. So bad neighborhoods or gangs is something you definitely want to make sure that you're not buying in, and you want to make sure that even if there's nothing that visually shows that it can be a bad neighborhood or a gang area straight away, you might have actually caught the area on a bad day. Maybe if you actually go on the weekend, there's actually more noise and more ruckus. So it's very important to do your research and find out that what is this area like, from Monday all the way to Sunday. Does it get really bad just on the weekend, or is it good right throughout the clock? And if it's good, then you're okay to look at buying that neighborhood. And again, you want to be doing proper research before you make that purchase. And lastly, we've got properties that are beyond repairable. You want to stay away from these properties because there's no point trying to renovate something that basically looks like this. You're better off bulldozing the whole building and rebuilding from scratch, and that would probably save you more time and money, realistically. And the reason why you don't want to touch properties like this is because renovations will take too long. In the time it takes to complete something like this, which to me, I could probably put an estimate of maybe 2 months to fix something like that because of how terrible it looks. In that time frame, you may have actually completed 2 or 3 other deals with properties in much better shape. And chances are dealing with stuff like this is more trouble than it's worth. If the outside looks like this, you can only imagine what sort of damage the inside's had as well. And often when you pull back the curtain, there's more and more issues that you have to work with when you're dealing with properties that look like this. And just as a rule of thumb for myself, when renovating, I like to keep all my kind of renovations within that 20 to 30 grand mark. I don't want to spend any more than that, because it means that it's money coming out of my own pocket. It's not borrowed funds. It's not other people's money or anything like that. It may actually be my own funds. So I don't want to keep pouring money into it and having to spend so much time working on it, going back there every other day to check what the progress is, when I could buy a property that has no issues or very little issues that I just need to do a cosmetic do-over, and I can put back on the market and collect my paycheck. So if you come across properties like this, especially if you're starting out, I'd recommend just staying away from it altogether. And guys, that doesn't mean that later on, once you're more advanced and built up the skills and knowledge and have the experience, you can tackle things like this. I've got friends that are also property traders that particularly only look for properties that are beyond repair. And they're able to turn it around very quickly, because that's the experience, and they're still able to make a healthy profit. But for me, guys, the strategy that's worked for me is not to actually work with properties that are beyond repairable. So there you have it, guys. We've covered the major property purchasing guidelines, the do's and don'ts, and what I suggest is actually printing this little section out and bringing it along with you when you're going out to look at property, to ensure, as a reminder, that you are ensuring that the properties that you're looking at have as many of the tick boxes ticked for the buy section, and they don't have any don't buy sections at all. If none is obviously better, but for example, if you're buying a cross-lease property that's also brick and tile, that's also road frontage, then hey, to me that's actually not a bad property to buy. But if we're talking, you've got it's a leaky home and it's also on a cross-lease section, and the area is also terrible, well, it's a no-brainer. The more things to don't buy that's on that list, make sure you kind of stay away from those things. So there you have it. Print this out. Ensure that you take it with you when you're starting out, and sooner or later this will become like second nature, and you'll be able to understand all of this without actually using a list as well.